Becoming a hard-boiled space sheriff in the galactic Wild West of Starfield's settled systems should have made for the coolest questline in the game. But it turns out that this untamed frontier isn't that wild, and its lawmen are soft-boiled at best. Across the length of the Freestar Rangers questline, the player will visit seedy clubs, high-tech star stations, run-down military installations, and much more, as they grav jump around the settled systems seeking to serve up some justice. A dish which, in contrast to revenge, is apparently best served lukewarm. And with each new settlement you explore, you'll be guided by a new face from the Ranger network, each with their own unique definitions of what the job requires. On paper, then, this story should be a thrilling patchwork of Wild West outer space action and detective work. But while I enjoyed getting to explore the worlds of the Freestar Collective, savouring the hopeless atmosphere of Hopetown and partaking of the local delicacies in Neon, the actual process of joining the Freestar Rangers is a consistently unremarkable experience. With a mystery at its heart that is ultimately solved by one of the worst evil plans you've ever heard, and a story full of flawed characters that just aren't very interesting.
Find anything interesting? Let's see what we have here. Interesting.
The Freestar Rangers questline kicks off when the player first arrives in Aquila City and discovers the Shore Gang have been at it again and have taken hostages in a bank robbery gone wrong. Obviously, given that the player is a random passerby without any qualifications in hostage negotiation, the Marshal of the Freestar Rangers figures you must be the perfect candidate to resolve the situation. So you can talk them into surrendering, or you can go in guns blazing and somehow still keep all the hostages safe. Either way, the player has clearly proven themselves worthy of becoming a Freestar Ranger, and will soon be deputized in the Rock, the headquarters of the Rangers, which is a far cry from the sleek, shiny United Colonies facilities in New Atlantis. Here, it becomes clear that the responsibilities of a Ranger mostly involve drinking in silence at their well-appointed bar. And obviously, at this point, I knew for certain that I was cut out for the job and was glad that I had agreed to sign up. After imbibing the requisite drink or two, your first proper mission begins, like all great space western stories, when you're sent to investigate reports of harassment on a nearby space farm. While accompanied by Ranger Emma Wilcox, you learn that a group of mercenaries called the First, who were attempting to steal this humble farmer's land, also hired a shipjacker to steal a Hopetech starship from the Hopetech factory in Hopetown. And so you head to Hopetown, where you meet another Ranger, Nia Kalu, who has somehow managed to injure herself and get her ship stranded in orbit after a run-in with some level 12 outlaw ships. And admittedly, here, I started to doubt whether the Freestar Ranger recruitment process was really as rigorous as it should be. Once you reach Hopetown itself, you're introduced to Ron Hope, the man who will turn out to be this story's ultimate villain. And for what it's worth, I think Ron Hope is a brilliant character in many ways. He's an arrogant, loquacious buffoon, and it's amusing seeing him snarl and twitch when you don't treat him with the special consideration that everyone suggests is required for a member of the Council of Governors. I'd consider him one of the most memorable characters in the game, but that doesn't mean his motivations make any sense at all. Regardless, revealing his involvement with the starship thievery and farmland stealing mercenaries will require a bit more effort on the player's part. On Neon, you'll meet Jalen Price, who will help you track down the starship thief, who then gives you an encrypted slate and 2 more names to hunt down. Seek out Maya Cruz at the clinic and you'll meet Ranger Ben Armistead. Follow the trail to a mining installation and you'll retrieve another encrypted slate. Visit the Red Mile and you'll encounter Ranger Autumn Macmillan, drinking at the bar like her comrades at the Rock. And she will reluctantly help you find a fella called Marco who has yet another encrypted slate. And then, back at the Rock, the socially inept ranger Alex Shadid will help decrypt those slates and point you towards the headquarters of the First, where you will fight their leader, Paxton Hull, and he will finally tell you that Ron Hope is the one who hired them. After all of that, then, you will ultimately confront Ron Hope with the evidence of his involvement, and he will explain to the player exactly what his plan was all along. And it's even more astoundingly unexciting than you possibly could have imagined.
You're right. Yeah, those families deserve to be compensated for the inconvenience. Perhaps a discount on their next purchase from Hope Tech.
In an effort to keep up with the competition by diversifying Hope Tech's business interests, they had apparently developed an experimental fertilizer that seemingly failed to yield results, until they realized that when used, it was eventually producing a more mineral-rich soil. According to Ron Hope, extracting this soil somehow reduced his labor and material costs enough to dramatically increase Hope Tech profits. So he gave the fertilizer out to farmers and then later ordered mercenaries to kick those farmers off their land to extract the soil. And in case the extent of the sheer dullness of that evil plan hasn't quite sunk in, let me repeat it once more in brief. Ron Hope provided special fertilizer to farmers, and then he paid mercenaries to remove those farmers so that he could install machines that extract the soil. I feel I should be clear here that I'm not inherently against stories about soil or fertilizer. As far as I'm concerned, a good story about soil will trump a bad story about robots and ninjas any day. But this is not a good fertilizer story, because the motivations are very questionable and the scale of the conflict is mismatched. When I spoke previously about Starfield's Vanguard questline, one of the comments I saw quite a few variations of was the suggestion that the use of a world-ending threat in the plot of games and media generally has gotten to be played out, and that people have grown bored of playing through that kind of story. And the thing is, I actually half agree with that sentiment, but the reason I think it feels tired and groan-worthy in other games, like Immortals of Avium as an example, is because those stories don't do the work required to get the player invested in the world, or build out the narrative in a way that makes that world-ending threat believable. But conversely, in Starfield, they actually do a lot of that work quite well. They just fail to capitalize on that world building towards the end. They laid the foundations for something big with the Unity and the huge galaxy, and then the ending played out a lot more low-key. And that problem repeats itself on a smaller scale in this Freestar questline. The hints and clues you discover throughout this story indicate that something sinister is afoot. The early quests suggest that you're facing a large mercenary organization, with plenty of soldiers, credits, ships, and contacts, and an axe to grind in the face of their tarnished post-colony war legacy. And after you've traveled to so many worlds, met so many new faces, and fought dozens of these highly trained and motivated soldiers, then discovering that this was all a play to extract soil is extremely underwhelming, because it doesn't scale with the expectations they have set for the audience. If this quest had been scaled back and set on a single planet, where there were 3 or 4 active farms, and the player, as a ranger, had to investigate these farms, follow trails, find some scruffy mercs in a nearby hideout, and discover it all led back to some evil plantation owner poisoning the crops of his competition, then I think that this sort of reveal could have worked. As it stands, though, I just can't comprehend the mixture of motivations and machinations here. If Ron Hope's dodgy fertilizer kills crops, then why would the farmers he gave it to even continue using it? And if the one upside of this fertilizer is that it ultimately increases the soil's mineral content, then why on Earth, or why on Polvo, would he not just acquire a huge parcel of land and use all his fertilizer there? There are so many planets that he could basically have all to himself. Why does he need the labor of unknowing farmers for this to work? It can't possibly save him that much work or be that much cheaper. Why couldn't he set up hundreds of robots and have them distribute the fertilizer before using his extraction equipment all on the same planet, thus saving on transport costs too? And then he wouldn't have to pay to hire a huge group of mercenaries either. Oh, and what on Polvo were they thinking with the stolen HopeTech ship, which took up a good chunk of the investigation? Paxton Hull tells you they simply needed another ship for their farm raiding activities, and Ron Hope thought it would make him look less suspicious, but then he didn't report it as stolen, which I think seems pretty darn suspicious. Ron Hope's plan seems utterly absurd to me, but at least if it had felt a bit more evil, then it might have offered a more satisfying conclusion to the story. What if Ron had been poisoning farms and then shutting them down altogether using brute force in order to cut off the supply of food to one of his competitors' factory settlements and give HopeTech an edge over the competition that way? Or what if he had been attacking the farms specifically to make the Freestar Rangers look incompetent, so that he could convince the Council of Governors that the Rangers were not fit for purpose and appoint his own military force? Either of those example options would have kept Ron Hope as the bumbling businessman whose evil tendencies emerge from his ambitions, and both would have offered a more dramatic and satisfyingly significant twist in my eyes. Whether you ultimately choose to take a bribe from Ron Hope and keep quiet, or you end up killing him, his terrible plan ensures that the story ends on a low note either way. But this ending is not the only big problem with this questline, because the Rangers themselves also ensure that getting to this point is nowhere near as fun as it should be.
You'd better start finding some answers. Your lack of progress is costing lives.
It must be very easy for you to sit back and criticize when we've been doing all of the field work.
I've done my part. Besides, this is Ranger business, so why don't you keep your mouth shut?
Let's move on.
The story of the Freestar Rangers questline is chiefly structured the way it is, I think, in order to take the player to as many new places and introduce them to as many Rangers as possible. And that could have been great, if not for the fact that these Rangers, who I figured would be moody, tenacious enforcers, are actually just not that cool. Aside from Marshal Daniel Blake, who is a well-drawn, crotchety, veteran sheriff type, none of them even come close to being as cool as former Freestar Ranger Sam Coe. And this means that dealing with other Rangers is never the highlight of each of the story's individual quests. Pretty much every clue you follow in this questline will take you somewhere where a Ranger is waiting to point you in the right direction. And because you're just a deputy until the very end, they all have seniority over you and aren't shy about reminding you of that fact if you step out of line. So it basically feels like rotating through a series of babysitters who aren't an offensive presence, but aren't a ton of fun to be around either. I have to think that having fewer Rangers around could help here by allowing the player to get to know one or two a lot better, but even then they would need to be much more inherently interesting characters. I'd have preferred it if Jalen Price was a cynical drunkard with a foul mouth, Nia Kalu behaved more like an excessively severe and overbearing school teacher, and Alex Shadid was an insane game genius who collected something weird like glass eyeballs. And with all the rangers you meet, surely at least one of them should have been a devious traitor to the badge, getting paid off by Ron Hope to plant false evidence and mislead the player during their investigation. Their personalities basically match their lame outfits, which are not nearly as badass as they should be. And even just giving them cowboy hats instead of baseball caps would have gone a long way. I actually appreciate the way this questline takes you all across the settled systems, because I personally enjoy the planet-to-planet travel experience in Starfield, and these quests are set up in such a way that getting distracted with other side activities or shopping never really detracts from the story. In fact, I fully believe that's how Bethesda wanted people to play this questline, because they want the player to see as much of this world as possible, and taking your time with the quests avoids each ranger interaction feeling overly familiar, because honestly, along each and every step in this story, it rarely feels like you're making significant progress. And part of the reason why is because it's like hitting the reset button every time you visit a new planet, where you have to follow a fresh trail and question different people only to come out with a new clue but no answers. Because it's only at the very end where anything here starts to make some kind of sense. Aside from wanting the player to see plenty of the settled systems though, I also think the idea behind having so many rangers was to suggest the scale, importance and influence of this faction. But honestly, all that it really does is suggest an extreme level of incompetence across their ranks. Aside from the fact that several of them never leave the bar, most of the rest of them seem to be doing a very bad job of being a Freestar Ranger. I'm willing to allow that the reason they're not very helpful during your quest is because they're taking on more of an advisory role, but they're useless beyond that too. Nia Kalu has jurisdiction over a very small settlement in Hopetown, which is basically just the Hopetech factory, accommodation and a bar, and yet she somehow missed a ship being stolen. It doesn't matter how well they might have tried to hide the crime, word would have gotten out and she should have been investigating. Jalen Price works in the seediest place in the settled systems, but has basically resigned himself to the fact that he has no real power there, and so he's just stopped trying. Autumn Macmillan gets annoyed when you try to ask her for help with your serious investigation because she has plans to get drinks with her sister and doesn't want you cramping her style. When it feels like none of these rangers epitomize what the role should be, it's hard to take any of them seriously, and it's even harder to suffer them treating you like an inept rookie. Almost every quest is framed as another ranger telling you what you already know while being bad at their own job, and it ends up making those stories less fun than they would be without those rangers looking over your shoulder. If the rangers were more entertaining sidekicks, they could have improved these quests, but they absolutely don't. Running the Red Mile would be more fun as a solo mission without Autumn Macmillan's attitude. Tracking down a shipjacker in Neon would have been better without a lecture on the flexibility of justice, because the most fun you'll have as a Freestar Ranger deputy are the times when you're on your own. Admittedly, I grew to sort of love the Freestar Rangers precisely because of how amusingly useless they were, but I wanted to love them because they were badass space rangers. I had hoped that the Freestar story would be a gritty adventure through the dodgiest, most crime-ridden corners of the settled systems, and while I never mind things going in an unexpected direction, I didn't love that this epic space western story resolved itself with a fertilizer scheme that's even more ridiculous than the Rangers themselves. But what did you think of the Freestar Rangers questline? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more stories and more video games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.